Well, good evening to you. It's Professor Jen. We're on spring break 2025, March. Good evening, good evening. Thank you to Captioning Services for everything that you do for us. Truly appreciate it. Well, you can see by my picture tonight, it really didn't come over very well, but I didn't want to find another picture because I want to talk about gaming, as in video gaming and playing games, etc., as a sport, as a hobby, etc., the art of gaming. And then I want to talk a little bit about fantasy, how I see it, and I want to use an example from 1976, a very interesting film, definitely at the time, at the height of pop culture, called Logan's Run. This is a copy of the original poster. It doesn't really transfer very well. I can see it myself now that I'm speaking to you. But I want you to see, what it sort of looked like. If you really want to detail, you could find it yourself on the internet. It has the rainbow. It had sort of a fantasy kind of look to it for 1976. This was considered one of the pinnacle of graphic arts, we could say, you know. And so he sort of looks like Logan there. He sort of looks like a Star Wars kind of guy. And Farrah Fawcett, she's, of course, very attractive in time and place, cultural context, pop culture. And she's got on, a short dress and, flowing hair. And they're really trying to beat the odds. People really didn't understand this film in 1976. And I bring this up as an example because very often people that might be your grandparents in their 50s or 60s, 70s, they might not really understand gaming. When gaming first came out, I remember because I was in high school myself, 1980s, we had Pac-Man, we had the Centipede, we had the Millipede, that was just about it. We had pinball machines, but we really didn't have much that really talked about character development, that talked about fantasy. For us to be transported into a different world, even through Pac-Man, Ms. Pac-Man, Millipede, Centipede, then I think the decade later, I think it was Mario Kart, Mario Brothers. You know, again, it was sort of cartoonish animation. It wasn't really a world of fantasy. 1976, we started to see a lot of film that had this level of fantasy, this other level of another world that sort of looked familiar, but it had some different wrinkles in it, some twists and turns. Now Logan's Run. So Logan's Run is a story about the world, a different shape, of course, meaning that at 29, your life is over. You die, you expire, your body blows up, it goes into this orb. And the premise is that you come back after you've been sort of reconstituted, recycled, and you come back and you get to start all over again in infancy, toddlerhood, adolescence. And in Logan's Run, everything is beautiful. It's very futuristic. It's very clean. Everything is, wine, sex, and song. Everything is just terrific because the message really is that youth is really, the thing to hold on to. Youth is the continuous aspiration, anything but get old. And in this film, Logan's Run, there's a love story. Of course, there's always a love story, right? In pop culture, no matter what the year, the decade, the century, there's always a love story. So there's this love story, and somehow or another, Logan finds out that when you get to this orb, you don't become reconstituted, you don't become recycled, and that when you get blown up and you die, you die. It's over at 29. And so, of course, he becomes, very disenchanted with this idea because nobody in Logan's Run in the film ever saw anybody make it past 29. So the film takes this change from one fantasy, moves into another with the new question, what happens if we leave our little planet, our little concept, our little community, and we break out of it because we don't want to die at 29. And so, of course, then the love affair is about he and this girl that you see in the poster, and they finally break out of this nirvana of sorts, and they wind up in what you and I would call the real world. And they encounter somebody in the real world who is outside of their fantasy and is apparently a very aged person. I would definitely say in their 80s or 90s. They've never seen wrinkles before. They've never seen an elderly person before. And they learn through the course of um their running away from this fantasy life where, everybody's young and beautiful until 29, that they learn that you can live happily ever after, and that this fantasy world maybe doesn't really exist. You know, so the film, it left a lot of people very confused because in 1976, we really didn't have mainstream fantasy. I was just talking to my husband before I taped tonight, and I said, well, what other examples could I use? Could I talk about gaming as it relates to Star Wars? His feeling was, well, it really didn't transfer over very well. I wouldn't call him a gamer, but he certainly knows quite a bit about contemporary video games and gaming, as we have kids that, grew up gaming, etc. But the idea that we can depart from our everyday lives, right? All of the stresses, the strains, all of the disappointments, and we can just transport ourselves into these different worlds. I remember when I was in junior high school, another example would have been Dungeons and Dragons, where I wasn't a big fan. I just never really got into it. Maybe I would have if I had friends that played it. But this idea that we could transport ourselves into other worlds. I can tell you where I feel I can offer an example. Very often, people my generation, especially girls, I'll offer an example for boys in a moment. Girls, we would play with doll houses. We would have all these fantasy roles, right? We would have the Barbie, and she would come with all of this great stuff, the car, the pool, the Barbie this, the Barbie that, all these clothes. We would go into a fantasy script. We would say, oh, I'm going to pretend I'm Barbie. I'm this career, that career. I'm also, a mother. We would have all of these sort of storyboards, we could say. And in marketing, as we all went along in my place and time, they started to create different pieces, different accessories to bring in to continue to play into this marketing fantasy, which did extremely well because we were selling them, in toy stores, etc. We really didn't have online shopping back then. Nobody even knew what that was, maybe a catalog, but the stuff was flying off the shelves. Mothers, grandmothers, dads, grandpas, uncles, they would wait in line for hours to buy these toys because it really was a whole fantasy life for many of us girls. I remember for boys, it became action figures. That was the very popular thing. And these action figures started to come on the back of the boxes with sort of character descriptions. I remember that they would come with different kinds of accessories in the action figures, like a little sword. I remember my son, one of my boys, he had like stuff that had shields. Then one year, I'll never forget this, we were in Walmart, the whole world seems to have gone to Walmart. We were in Walmart, and my son TJ, he's in his 30s. I talked about him a little bit. He's 32. He was born Christmas Eve. And I remember the week before his birthday, talk about really, having to compete with holidays. He always used to say, thank God nobody wrapped my birthday gifts in holiday paper. He really would have been depressed. I remember the week before his birthday, week before Christmas, Hanukkah, he said, look at this. And it was some kind of action figure castle. Maybe some of you have seen it, you're a little younger. And it was like a gray castle, and it had all these little like sort of Viking looking men, and they had shields. You had to buy everything separate, of course. Marketing was a wonderful tool, and it came with all these little things you could buy. Uh, and he kept saying, I know it's the holidays coming, I know it's my birthday, but I absolutely have to have this castle. And how do you say no, right? So I bought this castle, but it provided him with hours upon hours of fantasy, role play. You see? Here we are 30 years later, and now fantasy and role play is really what you and I would probably agree refer to as gaming. And gaming has provided not only distraction, hobby, it certainly has provided in the last 10, 15 years absolute ways to make money. Costume design in gaming, storyboard in gaming, writing in gaming, all kinds of different features in gaming. We have people that want to develop songs, music, etc., based on themes, thematic structure for gaming. So it is a whole world, you know. We say to ourselves, I remember many people when I was a young parent, they'd say, "Oh, I'm not buying the Nintendo." They would say, I'm not buying all of the Atari. I'm really dating myself here. And people would say, oh, it's just a passing trend. It's just a fad. And here we are. Clearly, it's not a fad. Look how we have the ability to hop on gaming all across the world with people live gaming. We have ability to do gaming on phones. You know, we have ability to have gaming on the computer. We have ability to have gaming 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? We can even game with people who do not speak the same language, who maybe are not the same culture. And I think gaming has really opened up a whole new world and a whole new vision for so many of us. See, you were born into gaming. You don't see how we had to make these contextual leaps, but it opened up really a whole new world, you know, where people could see beyond themselves, beyond their television, beyond their living room. I remember a time, this is so interesting when I think about that, like we wouldn't have even had the word gaming. The only word we really had was to play board games. So we would have like Monopoly, which was like sort of a fantasy, you know, it had a fake bank and you got money every time you pass go. So everybody wanted to roll the dice and pass go. You didn't need much skill. It was really based primarily on luck. The skill came when you started to buy the properties. You probably all know what I'm talking about with Monopoly. And it was sort of a fantasy world. Sometimes with my friends when I was young, we would make a little bit of a spoof off the Monopoly game. We would sort of then sometimes take other games like the game Life, and we would incorporate both. We'd add on kids and all these other things because it was a fantasy world. You see, we were trying to create for ourselves a diversion where we were having a departure from our everyday misery, whether it was doing homework, losing a tooth, breaking up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, having a spat with a friend, listening about your parents' divorce, gaming as we knew it, Monopoly, etc., was was necessary. I would even argue that gaming today, from this more sophisticated view using electronics, right? Gaming as you know it, as we know it, is, I think, a way to also develop insight. I think it develops creativity. It reminds me of persons who maybe do fictional writing, very similar. The idea that somebody is presenting to us a world that we didn't know, right? Presenting to us characters we never met, foods we never thought of, a world we just didn't know. So we could have this departure from our everyday life, be entertained, be educated, have communication, and we wind up jettisoned into this other place. Maybe that's the point of fiction, you know, the point of why do we read certain writers that write to us and transcend different ideas that we feel have us hooked. You know, I was talking to my husband, we were talking about Harry Potter series. Who would have thought? Who would have thought the Harry Potter series would have hung around as long as it did? So many different spin-offs of the characters, because why? We're craving sometimes a release from our everyday lives, you know. that old picture, you might think to yourself, you might have seen it in children's films when you were young. The idea that, you're underneath the blanket with a flashlight because you're reading in the middle of the night because you just can't put the book down. You want this diversion. You want to see this other life. How does it end, When we look at gaming and we see people here at RIT, we see people all over, they're like up all night, they're up several days, they don't take a shower. They get so involved with this other world, but clearly I can see how this can happen because when we have an ability to be entertained, when we have an ability to create, to have fantasy, to meet other people, that's the hook. I also think to myself, sometimes in pop culture, older generations really don't understand that so much sociability for persons your age, your generation, people that might be the generation ahead of you in their 30s, for them, sociability really does mean being sort of physically perhaps isolated on some kind of a phone, on some kind of a computer, on some kind of a connection through a television screen, but yet you're really not alone. You're with other people that don't happen to be perhaps in the same room at the same time in the physical space, but they're with you somewhere else and you're having this shared experience. It's very hard sometimes for some generations to really understand that when people might say, oh, well, so and so spends all their time gaming, and they really need to be in the real world with real people. It is being in the real world with real people. I'll close with a final thought. When the internet first became popular, somewhere around 1999, 2000, we used to have these chat rooms. I'm probably speaking a foreign language to some of you. We had these chat rooms that you could log on. Of course, Yahoo got rid of a lot of these chat rooms because they were causing security issues, human trafficking issues, issues where people that were very predatory, unfortunately, would seek out very vulnerable people would get on these chat rooms, sometimes for hours or days, and they would get to know one another. These chat rooms, like we had some that were very regional here in the Rochester area where people who would never have interfaced with someone would have like a handle name, some kind of a name that they thought up, similar to a character, maybe in some kind of a video game and gaming. And they would meet other people, have dialogue, etc., talk about everyday life, as if life were the game. It provided people with a lot of I would say fantasy, diversion from their everyday life. People would say, "Oh, well, here on Yahoo in the chat room, but also in the real world." We've come to terms that it is the real world when we're engaged in technology, whether it's gaming, communication with other people, online dialogue, online discourse, it is the real world. Certainly in the land of COVID, I can't stand talking about Uncle COVID, who visited us about 5 years ago to the day. You know, we would say, well, the virtual world, it's not a real world. Oh, well, it became a real world for many of you. You figure some of you might have been in eighth grade, ninth grade. Some of you might have been all of a sudden in virtual school. And people might have said, well, it's really not the real world. Oh, it became real right away. If you remember, you were logging on, doing all kinds of homework, doing Zoom, doing classroom exams, Zoom discussions, etc. For some of us, it lasted 3 months. For some of it, it lasted nearly a year. So it did become the real world. Look at our situation. We're online, right? Next semester, I'll be teaching this class in person on campus, which will be really wonderful for me. But it's been truly wonderful to be here with you. I don't see it as any different. To me, it's just as real. Sort of like gaming and online coursework. When online coursework first became a thing, right? We started talking in terms of synchronous. Then we said the word asynchronous. Then we said live time. Then in 2011, I said, oh, I have this idea. I want to bring LectureCast podcasts in my class. Everybody said, well, we never do that. I said, well, I don't care. I want to do it. I want that personal touch. I want that connection with people where I'm sharing ideas, sharing some meaning that has to do with any of our readings, some ideas for thinking, exploration, and if nothing else, diversion. I have so many people. I think if I count, I've had 9 different classes online since 2011. I think maybe even 10. And I think I've done close to about maybe 200 lecture casts in that period of time. And over the years, students have said to me, you know, oh, I bring other people in. They listen to the same thing I'm listening to, or my roommates say, what are you listening to? Or I might be sitting in a congregate setting and they hear one of my lecture casts that has to do with criminal justice, writing, something, some kind of topic, our topics that have to do with pop culture, and why it is that we're always trying to explain to other people the importance of different things, how the classic and the contemporary sometimes make a wonderful partnership. You know, this whole idea again, online coursework. People say, well, it's not rooted in the real world. Of course, it's rooted in the real world. Somebody billed you for it. You did preparation for it. We're together. We're talking about subjects. Then we find each other in chat. Of course, it's rooted in the real world. The same argument I just made for you, how video game and gaming is really rooted in the real world. It has to do with really communication and this idea of give and take and being reciprocal and at the same time entertained, at the same time to have an opportunity to be extremely creative. People that are developing these games, you say to yourself, what talent do they really have to possess? I sort of think it's several talents. The idea to find something that's so appealing that people want to leave their ordinary life, their everyday life, and say, I'm going to commit to all kinds of time because it's something that I can transport myself and still be entertained and meet other people. So really the argument for gaming, I think it's not that it's just pop culture. I think clearly it's here to stay. I mean, anybody that says gaming isn't here to stay has never really, looked at the entire hobby/social schematic of gaming. But I think for people to really understand all of the benefits of gaming, they talk about in neurodiversity, neurodivergent uh, learning styles, how gaming has really helped many students with their hand-eye coordination. It helps maybe with people that have different speech impediment, that they can have, freedom through a character, that gaming sometimes is a bridge that gaps persons that might have different learning styles that are not neurotypical, and it often brings persons together that are non-traditional learners and traditional learners. I think too, in gaming, we also saw something, a product, I don't know if they still make it, but you'll know what I'm talking about. Back in my day, it was called Reader Rabbit, and it had sort of cartoon, and it was on the laptop or the computer, and children in second grade, third grade, fourth grade would sort of get these prompts, with a screen and little figures that moved and sort of spoke to them. Usually, animals, characters, something like this, fantasy theme. And the student really had to read along. That was the encouragement. And it had, sort of a similar style to many video games. It offered some kind of a theme, it offered characters, it offered humor, sometimes it offered very serious subjects, uh, etc. So I think too, if we look back 30 years ago, we did have something similar that was, a product that we used with children that I say today, even though it was marketed as educational purposes, I think we could really even say that the Reader Rabbit program was really sort of the beginning of gaming, you know? So I think there's a place for gaming in everybody's life, whether they wish to use it or not. I think it has excellent application. They talk about application of gaming for persons with Alzheimer's in nursing homes. We talk about the application of gaming as we know it from these different packages that people can buy, like Just Dance as like a way to use dance and dance contests through gaming packages to be entertained. So I think the world has come to this new place. I think it frightens people when when older generations who don't have all the experience say, "Oh, well, there's, my grandchildren, my children, my significant other is spending 20, 30 hours a week on gaming." I think people really just don't understand that it's not really always an escape. It's not always a place where people go to get away from their lives. It's sort of in some cases, if not many, it's really an enhancement. It's an entertainment. I think for many people, I can't imagine that the argument can't be made that people get on gaming for the purpose of relaxation. I remember when I was a young kid and we used to play these Monopoly games. We would play all kinds of other skill-based games that also had to do with luck, maybe character development. We had this other one, the dating game. It was very funny. You would sort of ask questions, what kind of person you wanted to date, and it would have like a door number one, a door number two, a door number three. And we would spend hours playing these games, similar to the color forms. They were sort of like an acrylic board. They'd have a theme, they'd have characters. We would make up all of these skits, right? We would make up all of these personality traits, characteristics that the color forms had. It was almost like we were breathing life into them, and they would come to life and they were very meaningful for kids back then. But so certainly now we have more sophisticated media and people can enjoy it. That's my thoughts. That's my thoughts that fantasy is not a bad thing. So many cultures, so many very conservative persons in education, they say there's really no room for science fiction. They might say that there's no room for fantasy, this theme. And I argue, I say, oh, there's room for plenty because it's wonderful to say, oh, to have an alternative world, an alternative place. It's not evil. It's just excellent to have all these places. I think to myself, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, right? You talk about fantasy. Who doesn't want to be surrounded by gumdrops and candies all day, right? Nobody thinks for one moment that they're going to transport themselves from everyday life and live Willy Wonka. But to have this kind of passion to say, oh, I would like a little diversion from my everyday life. I'd like to be entertained. I'll close with this final thought. When I hear about people that are much older than me and they shake their heads and they say, "Oh, back in my day, we didn't have all this diversion. Pop culture, it sells this machine to young people, sucks them in. They're not reading, they're not doing all these classic things." They say, "Well, in the 1920s, especially around the Great Depression, Ziegfeld was a very famous filmmaker, and he was also a very famous show person. Ziegfeld Follies, Ziegfeld Theater in New York City. And even in the middle of the Great Depression, right? 1929, 1930, things weren't looking too good. And people would literally go and they'd pack the movie theaters, they'd pack the live theater shows. Why? Because they needed a diversion. Their lives were consumed by bad news. Of course, the simmering of World War II coming 5, 6 years after that. People were all of a sudden having food rations. Great Depression, people went from situations where they had a plentiful, bountiful lifestyle, and then everything crashed in the stock market. And people were dressed up, waiting on very long lines in this country for all kinds of rations and extra foods from agricultural outlets that the country put on. But yet, 6 at night, my friends, they were lined up to go to the theater, to go to the movies. Because why? Similar to how we feel today. It's wonderful to have a diversion. It's wonderful to have an outlet. It's wonderful to be entertained, and much different than being passive back in the 1920s, where you sit and you're part of the audience. One could say, at least this is transactional. At least the people that are today gaming, they're more involved. They're not only being entertained, they're also reacting and perhaps entertaining. So I say there's room for gaming, certainly. Do I think it's going away? No. Do I think there are many applications for gaming? Sure. Entertainment, diversion. I think to have a mental health day, gaming plays an excellent role. I think certainly for persons with Alzheimer's, I think for physical education, I think for people who wish to, have another world in which they can be absorbed, maybe work on their yoga, etc., have some kind of an interaction with even artificial intelligence. So many people are so afraid of artificial intelligence. We use it already. It's in so many aspects of our world. People say, well, it's not real. Of course it's real. It exists. Therefore, it's real. Today I was making a phone call to RIT, and the recording said, "This is artificial intelligence. Please speak into the phone who it is you wish to speak to." It seemed pretty real to me. I wound up speaking to who I needed to speak with. I guess the bottom line is that we should never really be afraid of, all these modernizations to classic ideas, how it is that we communicate with one another. We shouldn't be afraid to take these leaps. Everybody, I remember back in the 2000, somewhere around there, 25 years ago, people said, oh, cell phones, this will never take off. People aren't going to spend money on cell phones. Nobody's going to stand in the street and speak on the phone. Nobody's going to have any interest in that. And here we are today. The phone does so many things. It prompts us to take medication. It can even translate languages. It can tell the time. It can make phone calls. I type messages to people. I get on doctor phone calls on Zoom off the telephone. We just have to be able to embrace what we think is a trend or a fad. And then we come to realize it's here to stay. And it's not the enemy. Sometimes it's very refreshing. So I hope you have enjoyed my take on gaming as it relates to pop culture and the importance of it. I hope I gave you a few arguments in the event that you have anybody in your life that says it's just a fantasy world. Well, it's more than that. And even if it's just a fantasy world, so what? It's okay to have diversion. We've been doing that for a very long time. So I wish you well always. I hope you're enjoying your break, enjoying some warmer temperatures here in Rochester, if that's where you are. And if you're somewhere else, I hope it's all being really wonderful to you. And you'll hear from me as we move along. I'll keep taping this week and sharing with you some different ideas as we move really from our fairy tales, our Aesop, etc., to really films. We're going to move into a whole new section called, films and pop culture, television and pop culture, how it is that we receive media and news in pop culture. I think you'll enjoy it. I know I certainly will. And so I wish the best for you this week and to enjoy yourself. And I hope you have a lovely evening. Good night to you.